Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 91st video in our Master Series and the 5th video in our subgroup mixing. So in the last video we talked about an intraoral processing technique that basically tricks the mind into helping things stay centered with not too much spatialization happening. And the trick works really well. So in this video what we're going to talk about is some more drastic pannings. So basically, the first concept is you've got two tracks like we've talked about. Now with those two tracks, that we basically have some options. That we've got one track that is going to be like panned right, and we'll normally start at 50% right and left, and we can go wider. So the wider you go, normally the more delay you can put on one side or the other. And then also you can put more detuning on one side of there. So we're going to cover both those issues in this video. But basically, you can also spread this into multiples. So the concept here is pretty simple. If you look at here, in my DAW up to about 36.6 milliseconds, it still sounds like one hit. Depends on the instrument. Also, on a kick drum really close together, it's going to sound like two hits. But, depending on how far you pan apart. And these are some of the multiples that you can read here in fourths and in thirds. So, and detunings, I've found up to about minus 12 cents or plus 12 cents you can go before it starts sounding like it's actually detuned from the other track. So, this concept is very simple. I would start out normally that you figure out what, to me in my DAW, it's like 36.6 milliseconds before it starts sounding like it's two doubled hits. So I can go all the way right and all the way left, and I can put no delay on the right side, and on the left side, I can put like 36.6 milliseconds delay. And also on that track there, that I'm going to detune it. So I'm either going to put it at like minus 3 cents or plus 3 cents or plus 6 cents or minus 6 cents or plus 9 cents or minus 9 cents. You have to kind of experiment with that because the detunings add textural flavor to it as much as the delays. So now as you come in from that you have multiples of that. Now, the issue here is that's like, let's say that like half of 36.6 milliseconds at, 50% right and left. That's not an accurate thing, but, it would be like, not, or zero, or so you got 0 to 36 milliseconds from 50%. So if you got 50% from 50% right to 100% right, you have from 0 millisecond delay to 36.6. Now, normally that's not exactly accurate. That you can actually, if you have them 50% right or left, you can also have delays also. The understanding of this, the hard part about this type of technique is that on certain instruments, let's say I've got this panned out, I'm at 75% right and left. And on the left-hand side, I've got 27.45 milliseconds. Well, it sounds phasey on that instrument. On some other instrument, it might not. Does that make sense? It's kind of a problem, and sometimes you have to just start adjusting it. Sometimes it's very small increments that will cause the phase issue to go away. And experiment with different detunings. The going up tuning or down tuning up to minus 12 cents or plus 12 cents to add texture. I know that sounds funny, but it just adds body and stereo width to what's happening. So when you're dealing with like two tracks, that normally that I will start out, with those kind of concepts and evaluate. So let's say you've got 50% right or left. So at 50% right or left, I'd go like 18.3 milliseconds on the left side. And then basically, I've not found any, dropping of volume on the right side that works properly as a configurement, because basically it's on the right hand side, the side that's delayed, let's say there's 36 milliseconds, the side on the right is going to sound a little bit louder for some reason because of the delay effect. So you have to turn the volume down on the right hand side. Now, this is kind of a problem because your meters are going to tell you that it's quieter. But if you sit back, they sound like they're the same volume. So it basically becomes one of those things you have to really learn to trust your ear using this kind of processing. But using these types of intervals that we talked about here, any one of these intervals and other intervals, I mean, you can break this down to eighths, sixteenths, and whatever to find multiples that'll work that don't sound phasey. Because I'll be doing this on a saxophone and the delay sounds fine, and I do the same delay and the same panning with a tuba and all of a sudden, or some other instrument, and it sounds phasey for some reason. I don't know why. It has something to do with the instrument, and it has something to do how much you've changed the other instrument. So these are an experimentation, especially with just single tracks, double tracks, or two captures of the same performance with two different microphones, of how far you can get out there. But just remember, the closer you get together, the less delay you can put on the left or one side or the other, and the farther you get apart, the more delay you can put on between them before you start getting phasey sounding kind of stuff happening. So it's not really a scientific thing. It's a scientific concept, but there's no really way to tell you this is exactly what will work, because it may work in this situation, but it won't in another situation, and so you'll have to reevaluate. Most of the time, any work like that is an experimentation, almost always. So it's just a concept that you know is there. What this concept normally does is adds huge amounts of stereo field, to where you can add huge amounts of body to, you've got like even an out front track that's the main vocal. So you've done this work on the second track, you've added some different even or odd harmonics to it, you've done the EQ on it a little bit different, you've done some different body building on it or whatever to make it sound like it was from a really good different other microphone, and you've put these delays on it. And then you've started to drop the volume down on the side that doesn't have the delay on it, so that it just sounds equal level when you sit back. That this adds huge amounts of stereo field to your production. The problem is, especially on out front tracks, that most of the time with this type of work, the more delays you get between them and things like that, is that they have to be turned up. That subgroup will have to be much louder than the rest of the mix, so it doesn't get muddied and lost in the mix. So it basically works out to, it may not sound like it's a lot louder than the rest of the subgroups or things that are happening in the mix, but their meters will tell you that it's louder, so that it rides up above it. For some reason, the process and that stereo building of that and the effects that cause it to not ride above the rest of the mix as well. Plus, on top of it, if you've got a lot of real wide stereo effect happening in your supportive tracks and in your backing tracks, that it starts to blend into that huge stereo field that you build. And so you really need to push the volume up of those main tracks that you're doing this work on to make them stand out, so that you'll have like this huge stereo effect happening with these doubled tracks, or these two tracks that you put together, the same performance with two different microphones, that are going to have this huge stereo effect sound and be above the other production that has a huge stereo effect sound also. Or you might have the stuff underneath it that it doesn't have as wide as a stereo field, that you really wanted the stereo field work to make it sound like the out front vocals or the out front lead or whatever had this huge stereo field effect going on that just sounded wide. And then on that bus that you've worked in, you can actually put a stereo field enhancer plug-in to even make it more. Whereas the supportive instruments and the backing instruments don't have that wide stereo effect, and they're very much more isolated to where you put them, that doesn't have that huge spatialization and stereo field effect, that are way down underneath those main tracks, that just cause that out front track to have this huge stereo field effect, full rich sound that's just got this huge fill up the whole stereo field on top of the other stuff. And it has a really strange effect that the other stuff sounds more mono in form. And the out front thing sounds huge in stereo. So you got to turn it up a lot louder than the other stuff most of the time, but your focus is really on this really great performance. Sounds good. It's got this huge wide stereo field underneath this other supportive tracks and backing tracks that don't have that huge stereo field, so that you don't end up with mud. Because if you go do all that same stuff to a lot of the other tracks that are supportive tracks and backing tracks, you may end up with a whole lot of mud going on that just starts sounding really convoluted and unclear and things like that. Whereas those main out front things, I mean, it'll sound a little convoluted. It takes away a little bit of the clarity, there's no doubt. But it makes it sound like you've got this huge stereo field having those out front vocals. And then I'm rolling, I'm going down, or whatever's going on, that they just sound huge. Does that make sense? And everything else in the background isn't sound. You didn't do that kind of work on it. And, you know, the guitar players over there, and the bass players over there, and the drummers over there, and the pad synth players over there, and the saxophone players over there, and they don't have that body built into them to where they got this huge stereo sound, and you're not paying to it so much attention to that stuff in the background that doesn't have that work on it, because it's really supportive. And you know, and it doesn't need that, because it's basically rhythm and support for that huge wall of sound that's coming at you from that huge stereo field that you created on what you want them to be focused on, which basically has kind of a backwards effect of the video before the last video that we were talking about, reversing that to have it centered in your face. So it's reverse of that, but it's hopefully going to have the same effect. I don't say same effect. It's going to have a different effect, but it will have that effect of it being on top of everything and in your face, a reverse of that process that we talked about, squishing it up and making things centered, which it's hard to word what that exactly is, right? Because there's, you know, it's like having a huge stereo field sitting on top of, you know, a whole lot of stuff that sounds a lot more mono, that's panned out where it should be, that doesn't have all that width and stereo field build behind it, that's really supportive but doesn't conflict with that stuff that you have out front that has this huge stereo field that sounds just wide, thick, and fat and taking up the whole stereo field, riding on top of all that other stuff that's backing or supportive. So I hope that made that clear, because it's a very difficult concept without, you know, having you in the studio and letting you listen to it and showing it to you, and then have you sitting here and sitting back there and coming up. I mean, you know, it's kind of hard. So it's more of an experimentation on your part. Once you understand the concept, you can start applying it and seeing what I mean. And the concept should come across pretty easily. So the biggest things you're going to run into are phase issues and detuning and uptuning issues. You got phase issues, you have to find multiples that don't cause phase issues. And when you're doing delays, and when you're doing detunings, you have to find detunings with those instruments that are going to work. I normally start in increments of 3, so I'll go -3 or +3 cents, or -6 cents, or +6 cents, or -6 cents, or -9 cents, or +9 cents, and intervals like that. That I can find ones that make it sound nice and rich. And if you've done that work on the other tracks so they sound different, and you've done different work on them, that it comes out sounding like this really cool thing that just sounds wide, huge, full, thick, rich, lush, and in your face, riding around on top of everything else. And all the other stuff you didn't do that type of processing on, so it's very clear in the background. The bass is very clear, the guitar is very clear, the keyboard is very clear, the drums are really clear, and the vocal might sound, that out front instrument might not sound quite as clear, but it's a lot louder than everything else going on, so it does have clarity. So it's kind of a trick that, you know, it will have this clarity because of its loudness, and the other stuff will retain its clarity far underneath it in the background, that the people will really be able to pick up on the clarity going on with the bass and the drum and the kick and whatever's going on, and have that huge stereo field just happening on that out front instrument. And we talked about we can do this with different instruments also. So in this video, I just wanted to quickly address that. And the next video that we're going to go through and talk about doing that to more than just 2 tracks, and some options in doing that. So listen to that, take some notes, and begin doing some experiment, and just understand the concept. Peace, soap, love. I hope you enjoyed this 5th video, and I'll see you in the next one.